This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hi all, Rob here. Just popping in before the show with a little note. This particular episode that you're about to hear is a sequel of sorts to the one we did on writing formulas a few weeks ago. And if you haven't heard that episode, it's still okay to listen to this one. Basically what happened is after we did that episode, Jack Ward had a big debate with us about our presentation of the hero's journey. And so we basically decided to turn that into an episode. So this episode is the follow-up in a lot of ways to that episode. But some of you might not be familiar with the hero's journey, so you may want to actually check out one of the links about the hero's journey before listening to this episode. Or I'm going to give you a really quick, brief rundown of what the hero's journey is, because we tried to do it during the episode, but things keep getting off track as we're debating the different elements of the hero's journey, so I thought it's best to put a short version right at the beginning of the episode for you. The hero's journey was an idea put forth by Joseph Campbell, a comparative mythologist who wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And in short, he was a comparative mythologist, so he compared the mythologies of many, many different cultures all around the world. And he found that their mythical stories all tended to have the same pattern. They generally started with what's called a call to adventure, where the hero is living their normal life and then something happens that brings them into a new life. Then they receive some kind of aid. Usually he refers to it as supernatural aid, but this can be a mentor. Someone helps them in some way. They get someone who kind of helps them in their journey along the way, usually. And they basically enter a threshold where they begin to face challenges as they try to accomplish their goals. And they face what he calls challenges and temptations. And usually there'll be helpers and mentors and obstacles and other people they'll meet along this way. Eventually, they'll reach what he refers to as the abyss, or sometimes it's called the meeting with the goddess, where what happens is the hero realizes that he's been doing this the wrong way, that he's not truly facing what he really needs to face to solve the problem. So, he faces it. After his moment of revelation, he decides, or she decides, that they're going to try a new approach, one that's more honest to themselves as a character. They are now transformed. They atone for the mistakes that they've made and for the price they had to pay to go through the revelation, go through and transform themselves. And eventually they return back to their old life, but new and transformed and changed in some way. Now, this is one version of the hero's journey. There are a couple different versions. There's a version with 12 steps. There's versions with 6 steps. Dan Harmon did a thing called the Story Circle, which has 8 steps, which I'm rather fond of as a version of the hero's journey. And I recommend you look that up. I'll link to it. But that's basically it, right? The hero goes on a journey and they experience challenges that ultimately lead to transformation, and then they go back again, a newly transformed person who understands what they have to do. Now, of course, the term hero here is a bit of a misnomer. He calls it the hero because, of course, he was a comparative mythologist, and he's looking at heroic stories. But the idea that you're about to hear presented, as Jack will say, is that the hero is not necessarily a hero. They're simply the protagonist, or the person who is acting as our guide into this journey. They may actually not be a hero themselves. I mean, Deadpool would certainly not refer to himself as a hero, but one would be hard-pressed to argue that Deadpool is not going through a hero's journey in the movie Deadpool that was so popular last year. I know I loved it. And so The hero's journey has also become a standard part of Hollywood, thanks to a guy named Christopher Vogler, who wrote A Practical Guide to Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces in 1985. It was a memo that swept through Hollywood and basically transformed it, and now everyone in Hollywood looks at a movie as a hero's journey. It's become the standard template for Hollywood movie making. And once you realize that, and once you know what the steps are and everything, you can pretty much see it in almost every Hollywood movie. As Jack will point out, this is not necessarily required, and Vogler's version, the Hollywood hero's journey, is a little bit different than the Campbell hero's journey, which was much more open to interpretation. Because, of course, Campbell did not write it as a writing manual or for writers. Campbell was just a theorist going through saying, hey, look, these things all have similarities. And it's writers like Christopher Vogler or Jack or others who have taken it to the next step and said, well, this can be used as a template for writing. And that's what you're about to hear us basically debate on for the next 2 hours. If that really doesn't sound like your cup of tea, and you're not interested in hearing us argue about the validity of the hero's journey for the next 2 hours, you might want to skip this episode. It's a pretty entertaining episode with huge numbers of references to obscure sitcoms left, right, and center. Oddly enough, for some reason, it turns into a giant sitcom fest. I'm not sure why, but I think probably because the question of whether the sitcom actually fits into the hero's journey template or not is a question that comes up and keeps coming up during the discussion. But if this is not your kind of thing, come back again in 2 weeks when we'll have an interview with Will Meugniot, who was the showrunner of the X-Men animated series in the 90s, was also responsible for a little show called Exo Squad that some of you might be familiar with, and was involved in pretty much every Marvel Sunbow production, including G.I. Joe and all the Marvel superhero shows that came out in the 80s and 90s in one capacity or another. It's a fantastic interview, and we really had a great time interviewing Will, and so you definitely don't want to miss that one. But if you want to explore into the subconscious of humanity and the hero's journey, now is your chance. Enjoy the show, guys. Bye. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Yep.
And tonight, we're having a little bit of a flashback. A couple episodes ago, we talked about writing formulas, and during that discussion, we touched on the idea of the hero's journey. Now, there's been some feedback about our handling of the hero's journey and the whole idea of the hero's journey, so we thought we'd do a whole episode on it. And we couldn't think of a better person to discuss the hero's journey, besides John Campbell, of course, but he wasn't available, so we got Jack Ward instead. Welcome, Jack.
Fine. I think Joseph Campbell would have been much better than John Campbell, but he's better. Thank you so much for having me. It's always good to have the irritant in the crowd to come and talk with you guys. So I'm the one that made the big complaints, but I only complain because I love you guys so much.
I know, and you want us to be perfect. I understand that, Jack. I can feel the love. So, Jack, since we invited you on to talk about the hero's journey, I think it's only fair that you're the one who actually discusses what the, I guess, proper version of the hero's journey is with our listeners. So why don't you give us the lowdown on the hero's journey, and then we'll go on from there.
Well, I have to say, first and foremost, I love the hero's journey. I love the hero's journey for many different reasons. I love Joseph Campbell. I mean, the man is probably one of the top 3 people that I consider mentors in my life, and I never met him. So, and The Hero with 1,000 Faces, his book is like one of my most treasured books in my collection. You could burn 99% of my books, don't burn that one. It's also the book that George Lucas had on his desk when he was doing it. And if you want to watch Joseph Campbell with Bill Moyers, go watch The Power Myth, which they did at PBS, 4 episodes. I don't know if you guys got a chance to watch that.
No.
It's incredible to sit there and listen to him work with Bill Moyers just off the cuff. See, to understand Joseph Campbell, you have to understand here is a man who is a real educator in the primest sense, who not just knows his topic, but knows his topic so thoroughly, it's really hard to stump him. He's a man who knew the mythology of almost every major culture in the world, a variety, and such a variety that he would find all the connections in all these different things. So you would say, well, I always use the example of the Frog Prince, and he's like, well, the Frog Prince, it came from a Germanic folklore fairy tale. But you know what? In the Japanese version of it, this happens. And in the Russian version, this happens. Oh, and there's an African version here, here, and here, and these are the very places that they're different. But if you take a look at the way the Celtic one runs out, and then the Viking one runs out, and then the native ones in these 5 different tribes, these things happen. And here's where the commonalities are, and here's where the differences are. And so it's from that kind of deep understanding that he came up with the idea of the hero's journey. And there's a big misunderstanding, and I think it comes from, this guy, I think it's Christopher Vogler, who created who created the Hollywood version of this. There's this deep misunderstanding that this is an entirely sort of Western perspective of how story is wrought, and I vociferously fight against that on a regular basis, because the truth of the matter is, this is how human beings tell stories. And this is how human beings break down the way we tell stories. And when things don't feel right, it's often not... there are 2 possibilities as far as I'm concerned. One is you place different signposts in different places where they should be, or the pacing was wrong, or you're missing, so that's 3 things, or you're missing very specifically the elements that create the hero's journey. Now, I understand the hero's journey has, 12 stages. I break it down for my students into 5, because I think you can boil away some of the extremities, and the 5 stages, I think, pretty much are found in every single story that you can find. I've yet to find a story that it doesn't fit.
Okay. So can you boil those stages down for our audience? Some of them probably aren't familiar with the different stages.
Well, the original stages of the hero's journey, the 12 stages are, they start off with the ordinary world. This is where the hero exists before the present story. And I ignore that, because that's, it's superfluous in the respect, right, when it comes to a story, because most of the time you're waiting for the inciting incident, right? And so the inciting incident is truly the call to adventure, which is the second one. So in the call to adventure, the hero either seeks adventure or adventure seeks the hero. Now, is that not fair to say that, every story has that? If you don't have that, you have no story. There has to be some sort of aspect of something that's going on, so that we have a story to tell.
Usually, yes. I won't say 100% of the time.
Well, give me an example where I'm wrong. I need to know, because I'm fascinated about. I've never been able to find a particular story where either the hero is searching for adventure, and again, the other part of this is a lot of people are looking for the grand epic story. And it doesn't have to be the grand epic story. It can be a very mundane story. It could be the hero is searching for his toothpaste.
Right.
Right? And that's part of, trying to gain wisdom or whatever it is that you're having to do. You break it down. It's not that, it doesn't have to be the grand thing that people are looking for. Because that's the biggest argument that people have. It's just like, well, this works really great for Lord of the Rings. But, how does this work for an Adam Sandler movie?
Well, okay, just to answer your question, actually, the answer would be the Japanese Kisho Tenketsu structure, which is a very peculiar Japanese storytelling structure that they came up with originally for poetry. I think it's for kind of their poem. Anyway, the short version of the structure runs like this, okay? You introduce an element, you introduce another element, and then we just kind of see what happens when these 2 elements come into play with each other. Now, neither of those elements necessarily have to be actually seeking anything. They don't have to be involved with anything. It's just literally we're putting this element with this element. Let's see what happens. And
so give me a real story about like right now it sounds like a chemistry experiment.
Because that's kind of the way it works out. That's how I break it down.
Yeah.
Okay,
But you have to have characters, right?
You do, in theory, yes.
So if you have one character that ends up being, well, I mean, they could both be the main characters, but even just that is the call to adventure where they're both. Let's take it out of the Japanese thing. Let's take it to the Hand of Ulster. Have you ever heard of the Red Hand of Ulster story?
No. What's the Red Hand of Ulster story?
So the Red Hand of Ulster story is two brothers. And the element, they're just two brothers who have found a land together, which is the element that they've discovered, and through all that element, through finding the land, they have to decide who's going to have the land. Right. So right there, those are just two characters with an element thrown in. Suddenly, that element thrown in creates a call to adventure for those characters. So they both start rowing like crazy to get to the land, to get to Ireland. And the one stronger rower is going to be there before the other. So the other brother cuts off his own hand and throws it, and it touches the shore first. Therefore, he's able to name it and claim it. And that's why you see the flag, the Red Hand of Ulster. It's a Red Hand of Ulster in Ireland. So, I mean, again, we like to sit there, and part of the problem is that we sit there and we go, yeah, but it doesn't work with this particular structure. Those structures, to me, are just sort of like templates that you put on top of the idea. At some point, you got to meet somebody. At some point, that's got to change something in what you're normally doing. It's removing you out of the ordinary world in one way or another. Yeah. And because you're removed out of that ordinary world, suddenly you're on an adventure.
No, I don't want to get into this just yet. I think when you talk story, you can kind of go back to the original 3-act story. If instead of beginning, middle, end, if you kind of redefine it as beginning, something happens, it gets resolved. I think that's sort of a way of looking at it. Now, if you want a story without a call to action, what I would generally suggest would be just about any newspaper comic.
It's an interesting point. Can you explain more?
If you've ever read a newspaper comic, because a lot of them, it'll be a character kind of makes a pseudo-humorous observation about something.
Right.
And it's a little isolated kind of event.
Right.
But it doesn't have there's no call to action, because a lot of times there just isn't action involved.
Well, it's not a story, right?
Well, see, now I would say though, it depends how you want to define story.
Yeah, I mean, if you put a pictogram or pictograph up on the wall, that's not necessarily a story until you start telling the story of that pictograph, right?
Right.
So all it is an image. So unless you have the full spectrum of the comic strip, and you're reading Mary Worth or Mark Trail or Buck Rogers, and those are stories, because I own the first 2 years of Buck Rogers strips, and and they continue, and you can see, although the call to action is often sort of recycled so that they have a chance to sort of bring people up to speed, but there is a progression that happens all the way through those stories. Those are continuing serial stories in that way. So you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or as Joe would have called it, separation, initiation, and return. And again, he calls them different things. We call them different things, but we all see them in the same way, or else we don't feel comfortable with the way that story. Like, we should go back to mediums that we all agree that are stories. Storytelling a particular tale, a fairy tale, a movie, a novel, a short story, a play. All those kinds of things are truly the only thing I can think of, even in a play, that doesn't work is that may not work. Is things like theater of the absurd or something, right? And then you can't really argue so much that there's a story anyway. That they're sort of vignettes of imagery. They're They're poetic images, right? And not all poems are stories either. You've got ballads, and then you've got these lyricals that are there to paint an image. but not really to tell you a story from beginning, middle, and end.
See, I would still argue, though, that a lot of newspaper strips, there's still a story, and I'm referring to something like, say, like Blondie or Snuffy Smith, because you still have that, there's a beginning, something happens, it gets resolved, but a lot of times what that something is, it might be like an observation. Oh, it's Wednesday, Snuffy's probably out stealing chickens, ha ha ha, the end, and supposedly it's funny, but you're watching an event play out.
Right.
But it doesn't. And see, this is something I kind of wanted to get into maybe a little bit into the discussion. But I guess I'll start now.
Sure.
The reason why before I said that, say, a procedural follows a completely different idea from, say, the hero's journey is because I think you have to look at, say, characters, and you have to realize that characters exist in different ways. They're not all exactly a character. So you'll get, when you talk about, say, the hero's journey, that refers originally to legend, to literature, to religion, to these.
Right.
It's a story. It exists as a story. But when you start getting into the more modern era, you'll get things like characters that are licenses, and their existence follows something different. This is, I believe, it was the last time we talked about this. We talked about how Harmon had referred to something like, say, Friends, that they get up to that point of change but never quite get there.
Yes. And I think that is a problem that I can see myself when I look at the hero's journey, as Jack talks about it, is sometimes characters don't go through the whole journey. Sometimes they just go through one or two steps of it, and that's as far as they get. Like, the hero's journey may be a complete story or one version of where they could go, and where most stories do go, but it isn't necessarily where most stories have to go. Like, you can go through just a couple steps of it and then maybe go in a different direction or go back again.
But okay, I think what's we're misunderstanding though is the reason why things like Friends isn't really rewatchable is because it's not an effective hero's journey. So yeah, you can have stories that don't follow the hero's journey and they fail. And that's the whole point, right? Is they don't have lasting strength to that. It's my Frasier problem, right? Here we have a really good show that devolved. Why? Because the character of Frasier didn't grow. Whereas you take a look at some classic shows that, like even How I Met Your Mother, which I despise right now, and I've never watched it, but I've watched every single one of it like 5,000 times. Because I've never watched it, my sons have it on a regular basis, and I just get it, But even I can see that the entire conceit of the whole show is, here's How I Met Your Mother, right? So, and they don't get to it, and they don't get to it, and they don't get to it, and then they get to it, right? So it takes time, but you see the characters go through all kinds of changes. Go back to Taxi. Those characters grew, and they went through and that's why Taxi is considered to be one of the better sitcoms. Barney Miller, even to a certain degree, those characters grew through stuff. WKRP, they didn't end off being the same characters that they started off. They grew. And even Friends, I mean, as much as Harmon can argue that, there was an ending there. People got married. People's feelings got hurt. Some people got moved out. There was a change in the relationship. There was an ending that came. It took 9-10 years for it to happen. And
at least 10, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, but that's fine. There's no argument. There's no way to say that. And this is where I was saying is, like, what people complain about the hero's journey are really talking about milestones and goalposts and pacing. So, you can do the hero's journey in 6 acts, and you can do the hero's journey in 50 acts. There's no particular requirement that it has to be in 3.
Well, hold on a sec, though. An individual episode of Friends doesn't have a hero's journey in it. It only goes through part of it at best, and then it's a complete story in and of itself. Like the fact that it eventually does turn into a hero's journey, or as we look at it over like the whole like 11 seasons or something, is not really relevant here. The fact is, there were still episodes. Like the first season doesn't go anywhere, Jack. Even the whole first season, a whole 20 whatever episodes, doesn't actually go more than 1 or 2 steps of the supposed hero's journey, and just keeps looping back on itself.
It's kind of the point.
Exactly.
But no, I think you're. I disagree, and this is the reason why. So we didn't get through the rest of the list.
Yeah, we better go through the whole set.
But
actually, we better go through the set.
But let me give you one little quick thing. I think it does go through its own mini hero's journey because each episode has a requirement that they have to get at the end. It's kind of like getting, when you play D&D and you're sitting down for a session. It's part of the whole campaign, but it's just because you didn't get to the end of the campaign doesn't mean it's not part of the campaign. And maybe you didn't see why you had to pick up that key from the old crypt keeper, but in the end, it will come clear, kind of thing. So even the little things that they do is part of building those characters, building those connections, missing out or crossing the threshold, all those kinds of things that they talk about. So here we have the call to adventure, which I include the refusal to call when I do it in my little 5, which, again, if you refuse the call to adventure, you end up being a victim waiting to be saved, right? So meeting the mentor, I don't talk about that too much because, again, well, that is an interesting aspect. The mentor whole bit, it can be overstated in a story, and it can be understated. It could be really small. And so I don't use that with my students when I talk about it. So my first one is Call to Adventure. My second one is their 5th, which is the crossing of the threshold, which is really key to be able to going from here to there. In Friends, if you want the crossing the threshold, it's them meeting together in Perks for the first time kind of thing, which I think is like one of the very first scenes, right? It's just is they actually get together because they don't know Rachel, I think, at that point in time, and so they meet her, and she's some of them do, some of them don't. Then they number 6 in the hero's journey is tests, allies, and enemies, and again, that's sort of a requirement. That's just the running over the obstacles, right? You have some sort of obstacles of some sort. 7, approach to the inmost cave. Again, I don't get into that aspect because that's just sort of setting up for the ordeal. So I call the ordeal, which is sort of part and parcel of it. I call it In the Belly of the Beast. That's the 3rd one, which is the darkest times, because I just want to give the kids the outline. And so if you're looking at the Lucas, I always use these examples. The darkest time in Star Wars is when they're doing the Death Star run and everybody's being killed, and Han Solo's taken off, and nobody's going to make it. Right? Yavin's move is going to be blown up. And you give up. R2's been shot. You either you give up or you have to push through it. That's as they say. So being in the belly of the beast.
Right.
In the Matrix, it's really clear. And I watched the movie The Matrix, and I wasn't prepared for it, and it was perfect when you're not prepared for it, and you see. The main character, Neo, gets shot, and you're like, I know the rules of the game. He's now dead, right? And the first time he gets shot, you're like, okay, well, maybe he can survive that. And then he just opens up on him, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, oh, no, this is so bad, right? And you're right there at that moment because you know that's the end. In the Hunger Games, they're going to eat the berries, right? Because they can't, only one of them can survive, and neither one wants to do it. They're ready to do it. They're ready to just commit and die. So all those things happen in the belly of the beast. And then we have the reward, or seizing the sword. I call it facing the dragon and gaining the treasure. And so either you have to face the dragon and defeat them, or you gain the treasure. Either way, you're gaining information, or you're gaining something that you've learned, right? If you want to go to the long version of Friends, you can simply say that's the marriage between Courtney Cox's character and Matthew Perry's character, which I can't remember their names at this point, because that's the moment. That's the moment when all those things change, right? That's the moment where they grew to that point. We were getting misdirections with Ross and Rachel, but the real relationship was them all the time at that point, right? So And of course, we get that reversal because Ross and Rachel end up together in the end anyway. Oh, spoilers, folks. I should have said that.
Yeah, well, don't worry about it.
Anyway, so, and then, of course, the road back, I don't go with that because it all comes back to the return, which is what, the road back, the resurrection, which is number 11, and the return, where you have to go back to where you ended. And again, what do friends end at? They end at Perks, right? So, and again, it's just I'm pulling what the example that you guys are brought up, right? So, if you go and look at movies, this is the same way. This is why they go back to Hobbiton, they go back to the Shire. This is why there's at the end of Star Wars 4, they have the medals, right? This is why in Hunger Games she goes back to District 12, because you have to go back and transform society in a small way, even by showing that you're different, right? And so. This is the large one. The small ones that are still involved could still be within some of those sort of minor aspects of gaining that treasure or going through that ordeal, or those little aspects of that one stage that they're in within the whole story. Right. But like I said, there's all sorts of stories that only use part of these stages, and then we feel uncomfortable because we don't feel like we've had a full meal. We don't feel like they've done enough to to really feel like it was a properly done story.
Right. See, now my thing with that would be is, I'm not going to say that you're wrong, but this goes with what I said before. I think what ended up happening was the idea of the hero's journey kind of usurped a lot of things for our entertainment and then got shoehorned in. And
You're right.
Because a lot of stuff, like I would say that the quintessential example of a story that doesn't follow that is every sitcom ever made up until about like 1986, with a couple of exceptions, because they're all about homeostasis.
They're all about no change.
Yeah.
They're all about each episode. Everything has to be exactly the same at the beginning and the end.
And how many of those have ended up lasting through the test of time?
Yeah, but I can cite the best example of a show about nothing ever made was The Cosby Show. Like, nothing happened. It was just these people hanging around being pleasant, and that ran forever. That became a template, so that during the early 80s, every sitcom up until Married with Children was The Cosby Show, where like nothing happened.
Well, again, I don't know if nothing happened. The characters grew up and they moved out, and some other characters moved in, and they had a brand new girl, and then they ended up having to grow. The story of The Cosby Show was about the parents in the end, about the parents letting go of their kids. That was the hero's journey for them. You have to look at the question of the story, right? So what's the question in The Cosby Show? How do you get rid of your kids and still be friends with them? And still be friends with them, right? So, because there's all sorts of times where Cosby's like, I brought you into this world, I can take you out again. Like, that was one of his main things. And there were challenges where, oh my God, I may not be able to rescue a relationship with Theo because he's driving me crazy. And while there was lots of humor in there was a lot of truth that people felt deep down, like, oh my God, I have these same problems with my kids. And yes, it was light fare, and yes, it was all that kind of stuff. But in the end, they're the only two that walk away. That's why they came back with that other show with just those two as a couple. Because they had completed that particular hero's journey. Now they said, what would happen, and they don't even use the same characters, what would happen if we had two characters that had that same journey as we had, and what's their next hero's journey?
See, I think you're being a little generous to the whole thing, because I think the only time you see actual change in most sitcoms is when you get like the Cousin Oliver syndrome, where circumstances outside of the story necessitate
Brady Bunch.
Change.
That's a Brady Bunch reference for those people who didn't know. Don just made a Brady Bunch reference.
Yeah.
There you go. And I knew it. I knew it. Oh my God.
Actually, I confess I didn't know what he was talking about. And
there you go.
I actually did watch the Brady Bunch when I was a kid.
Yeah, that's the later. Oh, that was awful, wasn't it, Don?
Yeah, and that typically for any sitcom is the mark of doom when they introduce the new cute kid, which they only do because either the old cute kid is hitting puberty and not cute anymore, or you've run out of all of the main character can't get laid, so now he has to get married, and we'll do the family life story kind of thing.
Right.
Which
again, it brings back that same question for me, though. Does it last the test of time? Could people go back and keep watching Brady Bunch over and over again? They can't, right? Because those things don't, you're waiting for that payoff that happens, that completes the mythic story, and it doesn't happen. This is why we don't watch Growing Pains over and over again. This is why we don't watch Family Ties over and over again. This is why we could go on and on and on with every sitcom that doesn't. But the ones that do... The Taxis, the WKRPs and Cincinnati's, those ones, those resonate because they have completions, they have growths, they have all the elements that we look for in that story. And I agree with you when you say, Hollywood's been churning out, the hero's quest, the hero's journey. But the reason why they do it, why we don't like that, is because they do it badly. It's not because, and it's just the same as like, oh man, that William Shakespeare. All of his plays were done before, man. He did. There was Greek plays, those were Italian plays, and he did it. But why do people read them all the time? Because they were done well. It wasn't that they were new. It was the same format as what were done many, many times before. It's not the format that's the problem. It's how well it's done.
See, I would disagree, because when you talk about your Brady Bunches and your Cosby Shows and your Growing Pains, we do watch them over and over. It's just every couple of years they get labeled something else, have different actors, and then out comes pretty much the same. Yeah,
you're right in that we watch the same thing over and over again, but those don't last either. So what happens is they go, okay, this is a hit for so long. What's going to be a hit for so long? But in the long term, it's the ones that have the full arc, the Breaking Bads, the Sopranos, and those are the ones that people buy the DVDs for. Those are the ones that people. There will be people who will buy some of their favorite old time stuff, but that's just that's sentimentality. It's not for the story. Nobody watched Brady Bunch for the story.
I'm sure some weirdo somewhere did.
I watched, but generally, right? We're talking generally. I watched WKRP for the stories. There was particular stories that were really funny, and it was because those characters went on that journey. I always use WKRP because I think it's probably one of the top comedies of all time. I think it was brilliantly done. But what's his name? The salesman, Herb Tarlick. Yeah. Herb goes through a huge change.
Right.
He's always going to be a little bit slimy, but he stops being the slime ball, right? And he grows. Go back to Taxi. It's the same thing with the character Louis De Palma. He's somebody who is the bad person everybody hates, but then he eventually becomes one of them, right? And he's annoying, he's a painful person, but he grows. He grows, and he becomes less of the shadow, the dark character kind of thing, and more of the trickster character. And again, I'm using more of his perspectives. It's funny. I mentioned that bit about the Adam Sandler show. Have you ever seen the Gloves and Boots video that they do on the hero's journey?
No.
Yeah, go look that up. It's a little 5-minute thing. Do you know Gloves and Boots?
Yeah, I know of them. Yeah.
Yeah, they do a great little 5-minute thing where the one guy goes, "Why do Adam Sandler movies suck now?" And it's because he says because he doesn't use the monomyth anymore. That's why Happy Gilmore. No, it's not. Maybe it's not Happy Gilmore. It's the other one. Anyway, one of the movies, because I don't like Adam Sandler movies very much either, works, but Jack and Jill doesn't. It's because he's moved off that particular understanding of the way to tell the story. And it's when those hard and fast rules happen that we go, oh God, 20 minutes in, I know, crossing the threshold. Jesus, Murphy, guys, come on. But then you take a look at John Carter, and they do the whole hero's journey, but he does it in 6 acts, and it takes them 40 minutes before he has his first inciting incident.
Right.
The first inciting incident isn't going to Mars. You expect that. The first inciting incident is when he meets Deja Thoris, right? So that's what the guy argues in that particular podcast, and I think he's got a good argument. The story toolkit, I believe. I talked to Rob about it earlier. So it's when we take story that feels like a formula and we change it so that the story doesn't change but the formula is hidden. That's when it becomes magical for us. Not that we have to get rid of the particular formula. And again, I don't think it's a formula. I think we're hardwired to tell stories a certain way.
Right.
And I think to tell good stories a certain way. And I think that's happened all the way back. You can go back to the oral storytellers. Well, they'll sit there and they would tell stories, and the person's like, no, you can't end it like that. Why not? Right? Because that's not. He's got to come back from the grave, right? Okay, fine. Arthur will come back someday, right? When England needs him most, that's when Arthur will return. Okay, now you're done. Thank you very much. Yeah. So the audience does crave that because we have a genuine sense of rightness. And I think it's because we don't just go to, and there's a really good, I'll have to send you a link for this too. There's a really good, I don't say very good. He's not a very good speaker per se, but he makes a really good point. That we go to movies because we want to see reflections in our heart's desires and our fears.
Right.
And those kinds of things operate in that same, okay, tell me the story. When does he come in? How does this first happen? Where does he meet this person? What sends him on this particular voyage? And I tell my students the same thing. I say, look, it's not only just epic movies; it's every movie, and we go through every movie that they throw up, and I tell them exactly where it fits in that if I know it. And then I say, it's your life. I mean, you come into high school in grade 9. What's your crossing the threshold? First time you've gone in there, call to adventure, got to pass. If you don't pass, you become a victim waiting to be saved. Right? Exactly. If you don't cross into school, you become a victim waiting to be saved or homeschooled. The same thing. I'm sorry. I'm a public school student. I'm just kidding. And then
He's not kidding.
He's not kidding. I got to keep my job somehow. And then all these guardians, these things that you follow, that teacher that won't give you a chance, or that student that's bullying you, all those things, it all fits within how we see the world. And I tell students, I say, I don't believe gravity is the most important aspect of the universe. I think it's story. I think everything is story. You can't tell about gravity without telling a story. You can't tell about how stars began without telling a story. Geologists are sometimes the best storytellers in science because they have the ability to see the long term of something. Well, first there was this, and then there was this, and then it eroded, and then the two met together in a romantic grotto somewhere and produced this great sedimentary structure.
So then how do you explain the Stooges?
Oh, the Stooges always have their own thing, too. I mean, if you take a look at the Stooges, they're always trying to get a job, right?
Right.
They're always trying to get away from a guy, or they're looking at a pretty girl. Usually that's Curly, but you could consider that pretty girl to be a threshold guardian of some sort. That's the other thing. That's like, I mean, if you take a look at Joe Campbell, he talks about, all the characters they have. You'll find the same characters in every story, right? You'll find the hero, of course, the herald, the mentor, the threshold guardians, and the trickster, the shapeshifter, and the shadow. And a lot of comedies even, you see all those characters.
The only thing, though, is the Stooges, there's never that changing moment.
Well, it's not, again, we're assuming that the purpose for every single hero's journey is internal transformation. And that's not necessarily the case.
No, it's not, but hold on. The Stooges don't change society around them either, usually.
They change their circumstances, oftentimes.
Not usually.
No, usually they get slapped around and then they run away with their pants on fire or something, and that's the end.
Yeah, like the Marx Brothers.
Yeah. Like, they don't change society, they're victims of it.
Well, no, I mean, they'll escape prison, they'll escape stuff. They'll still get away with their with something from the end, right? Maybe it's knowledge we can never be painters again in this town, stupid. What? Yeah. I mean, sometimes that's all it is, right? Sometimes it's knowledge. Sometimes it's a matter of this won't work. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm trying to hammer something into the wall with a fish. This won't work. The end. My hero's journey's over. Time to start another one.
Right.
See that?
Okay.
That
Sorry, Don, go.
I was gonna say that's where I think, and again, going back, I think sometimes like the Stooge thing, I think is a bit of a stretch. Like you can make it fit, but I think if you're trying, you run that risk again. Where like I think we're at that because Lucas was such a big fan of the hero's journey, everybody wanted to make Lucas money. That whole idea has become gelled. It's a specific formula.
Yeah.
Everybody follows it. The audience is now expecting it because they've been conditioned for it. And you miss out on a lot of stuff because you couldn't really have the Stooges now because you don't have a receptive audience. And that way of they hit each other for 20 minutes and then we call it an episode.
Excuse me. Oh. Sorry, I just burped.
Oh, okay.
We could have cut that out, but not anymore.
Dun, dun, dun.
I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, no, but that's what I was getting at, and that's why I do think, again, that, like, I think the three components of any story, character, plot, and setting, I think the hero's journey is the quintessential character-focused story, but I think that, again, the procedural, like we were saying, is the plot-specific one, because you don't get, in a lot of them, those steps where the characters develop. They're ciphers. They're almost props to further the plot itself. And I do...
I see where you're going with that, and I don't know. First of all, I would go back and say, really, how popular are the Stooges nowadays? Most people don't really... I mean, they were popular, again, for their time. Therefore, they didn't have lasting resonance. And if we're talking about things that have lasting resonance, that's what we're talking about, the hero's journey. Things that actually work in the long term and work between generations and work on that kind of stuff. So, and maybe that's the reason why Blondie isn't that important. And Calvin and Hobbes is, because it does follow a progression, right? Okay. But let's take a look at that aspect of what you're saying between plot and character. That's an interesting suggestion. Lots of people would argue that, honestly, if you look at the book Lord of the Rings is absolutely the hero's journey, but it's the hero's journey of the band, right? So it's not just necessarily Frodo. So, it's the hero's journey of the band. The whole aspect is the story, the plot, because it doesn't go anywhere unless the plot drives it, right? And so I don't know if you can really... I think a good hero's journey can't necessarily be driven as strictly a plot story or a character story. I think character-driven stories don't tend to have really intricate plots.
Right.
And so when we're talking about the hero's journey, oh my God, it has to have a really intricate plot, at least the traditional epic ones that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I believe you can do a hero's journey with The Notebook. I think you can do the hero's journey with most of those dramatic kind of movies that we talked. I just watched what was it? What was it called? It's like Motion or something like that, but it was like maybe it's not that. What is it's got Will Smith and Margot Robbie, and Will Smith is a trickster. He's a character.
Oh, I know the movie you're talking about, but I can't think of the name.
Yeah.
Oh, what's it called?
It's such a simple word, and that's why you forget about it, right? So it's like movement or motion. It starts with an M. But the fact of the matter is that that's a comedy drama kind of movie, and yet absolutely follows a very similar kind of the hero's journey because of the way we try to tell stories. And I wonder if it's because we're trying to make stories that resonate more, as opposed to just sort of telling pastiches. Like, we used to be burlesque. Right? We used to come up as like, okay, here it is, and that's the punchline. But damn, okay, I'm on. Here come the naked ladies. So, and that's good for the moment. It's like telling a joke, right?
Right.
The joke is funny for the moment. The sitcom is funny for the moment. But where are the residuals? Where are you going to come back and watch Die Hard every Christmas? Right? There's those certain movies that people, and that's what Hollywood wants. And
Right.
maybe that's why they're in love with the hero's journey, because they know if they get it just right, they're going to get that movie that people go, I got to watch it again. It's March 14th, and I always watch this on March 14th. But I don't know. But every time I look at really successful movies and really successful novels and stuff like that have lasted and that
Right.
continue to last, I keep coming back to, yeah, it kind of fits. It kind of fits. But maybe I'm wrong. I have been before.
Well, it's a chicken and egg thing, right?
Yeah.
Are they the best movies because they follow the hero's journey, or are they, or are we saying, oh, look, or are we just using them as the examples of the hero's journey, so naturally they follow it? Like, is it truly a chicken and egg situation?
So are you trying to suggest that because Hollywood's enamored with the hero's journey, of course the ones that are successful are hero's journeys, or?
Well, that would be one take on it. Yeah, I could go with that.
But I'm just saying that if that were the case, then you'd have to go back and take a look before we got really enamored with the hero's journey and look back at, like, Casablanca. Is it a hero's journey? Sure. Robin Hood. Is it a hero's journey? Sure. I mean, like, you could go back to the ones that are back in the golden age of Hollywood, and they're still doing the hero's journey. It's just that the timing's off, right? The timing's different than what we've got in Hollywood. We really hate the Hollywood timing thing right now because we're all doing Save the Cat, right? 24 minutes, this is what's happening. 44 minutes, this is what's happening. It's not that Save the Cat is echoing the hero's journey and that's why it's the problem. The problem isn't that. It's that the format is so stringent based upon time, based upon what our expectations for the next gasp is. Because the hero's journey itself, as we kind of pointed out, can span seasons of a television series. It can span, long a mini-series. It can span a couple of episodes even. It can be one single movie. It can be all those things because it's not defined based upon having a particular 6-act or 5-act or 4-act or 3-act or all the turnarounds. And it's based upon what happens in any story.
See, I think you mentioned going back to like the golden age of film and such, and I think at that point you had a lot of movies that didn't follow the hero's journey because like you mentioned, say something like Robin Hood, like the Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler era movies. They're not a hero's journey because the hero isn't really different at the end of the film. They're what moves the story along. The villain does evil. The hero shows up. He, sword fight, sword fight, beat the villain, kiss the girl.
You're falling into the modern trap of what the hero's journey is, where it has to be transformation for that individual person, inside and out, right? That's the modern day Chris Vogler version of that. That's not what Joseph Campbell's saying. Joseph Campbell says, yes, that is part of it. Doesn't have to be, though. It can be transformation of society, which totally happens in Robin Hood, right? I mean, he goes through a transformation. You can't argue he does too as well, because he starts off as a nobleman, and then he loses everything, and then he goes into the forest, and so and then he comes out of it, and he transforms society when Richard comes back, and they overtake King John. So that there's that aspect of it, and it doesn't have to be a big transformation. And that's again, we're so used to the Hollywood version of this that we forget that there's nuances in story, that it doesn't have to be the big, overpowering, starting off Harry Potter in a closet, ending off Harry Potter, greatest wizard ever lived,
Right.
And that's what we hate, right? We hate that because, like, oh God, here comes the another awkward little boy or girl who's going to end up being the savior of the universe. And we see the same kind of problems in the sequel syndrome, right?
Right.
Because it's like, okay, well, they saved the world this time. What are they going to do? Save the solar system, of course, right? Oh, save the solar system. What's that? Well, the universe. What else are we going to do? Now it's parallel dimension saving, right? I'm just like, they always have to go bigger and bigger and bigger because They're stuck on the big story. They're stuck on trying to do that. But that's not what necessarily the audience needs. The transformation doesn't have to be huge. The transformation can be, it has to be poignant. It has to resonate with people. And it can be character-based and it can be society-based, but it doesn't have to be big.
See, I think there's a difference, though, between transformation and resolution.
Okay.
And I think and that would be the idea, because I think of like a lot of the more like nihilistic kind of films that I've enjoyed over the course of my life, where we can even go back to say like the Errol Flynn kind of swashbuckling film. The hero defeats the villain, and it does change the world, but it doesn't. I'm trying to think exactly how to portray it. It's not portrayed as a transformative moment. It's portrayed as the resolution to an action.
Okay, how about Eating Raoul? Is that a good example for you? Remember that movie?
Where guys sit around talking?
No. Eating
Okay.
Raoul. You've never heard of Eating Raoul? Have you ever seen Eating Raoul, Rob?
I've never seen it. I've heard of it because Superstation used to play it back in the 80s, like when there was the first cable movie channel.
Yeah,
used to play it to death. I think
it's an early 80s movie. It's a very, B-flickish kind of movie. And the plot line is there's a lovely couple, kind of. One's really attractive. The other one's kind of an annoying guy. And they want to open up a restaurant. And they find they don't have the money to do it. So some guy leches on the attractive girl, and she ends up like clocking him with a frying pan. And they end up finding Raoul, who's a shady character, to get rid of the body, and they rob his pockets, and it goes into the restaurant fund. And eventually they thought, hey, we can make a lot of money doing this because there's a lot of really, really disgusting people. So we're going to put out advertisements for sexual deviants. We're going to lure them into the apartment, and we're going to use the good old frying pan to take care of them, and then Raoul will get rid of their bodies. So they make $50 at a time or something like this. At one point, there's a very funny sort of situation where they go in, there's a hot tub scene, and the guy throws in a toaster, right? And they just sort of go, oh, and they open up like flowers. And I mean, they just like move out as if they're doing some sort of synchronized swim when they all get fried by the electric toaster. But then they realize, oh my God, Raoul is making so much more money because he's taking their bodies back, he's cleaning out their houses, he's selling their cars, he's doing all this other stuff. So they get really angry, and Raoul starts leching on her, which she kind of likes, but it doesn't sort of... So the husband, and they're anti-sex, right? So the husband clocks Raoul, and then they're upset because the person who's coming to sell them the restaurant, they have a place, a location, everything, who... this is all spoilers, by the way. It's like 50 years old, but spoilers anyway. And they come and they go, what are we going to do? And they go, oh, well, I'll get my you make a pate. So they're literally eating Raoul, right? And there's like this very famous, it's very dark comedy where there's a guy who's like, what do you think? And the guy's like, well, this is really tasty. And the husband who hates him because he was leching on his wife, he's like, that's tough meat, you know? She goes, I think it's tender, right? So they get, so you can say, well, the world isn't transformed. Their world is transformed. At the end, the resolution is they get their restaurant. So the whole world isn't transformed, but for them, it is the better in the end. So the whole world isn't transformed in the swashbuckling things, but for the people that we know within that story, their lives are going to be better because the Captain Blood, for example, which is another famous sort of Errol Flynn movie. You know, Captain Blood has redemption for who he is. He's brought his friends along. Their lives are going to be better. The right has been wronged in a very universal way, even though it's not a physical way. The wrongs have been corrected upon, and there is that kind of transformation that goes on. So even every little resolution, in my opinion, is a transformation of some sort.
Now, what happens if it all goes south?
Well, not all transformations are good.
There is that.
Right? I mean, that's the sad truth about stuff, but there's the opportunities for change. Like, let's take a look at Hamlet. Right? I mean, you take a look at the tragedies. There's a reason why Hamlet always ends with a hopeful note. And the hopeful note is transformation. Like Horatio is there, and the Duke who comes in, or Fortinbras comes in, and he makes the entire speech like, all this awfulness that happened has been cleansed, basically.
Right.
There's a transformation that's occurring. Now it's everybody's dead. Everybody's been killed. But that was part of the hero's journey of getting rid of the rot that was in Denmark.
Okay.
Now, you can say there are movies that don't have any of that. And I can say to you, they tend not to be movies that people, they'll remember them for the things they could have been, not for the things that they were in the same way, right?
Well, because I'm thinking, what about Mad Max?
Which one?
The original.
The original?
Yeah.
Well, again, I would take Mad Max as a trilogy, right?
Okay.
So, because I think that's what it was, every movie that comes in becomes part of the larger story of Mad Max, right?
Right.
So, in the end, the final one, is there transformation of society? Yeah, right? There's the whole suggestion that they're going to build a better world.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happens in Beyond Thunderdome, right?
Yeah, they're going to build a better world with 12-year-olds. Okay.
Psychotic 12-year-olds, but it's going to be a better world for them, right? It's going to be a better world for them, and the old way has moved past, right? Mm-hmm. The old ugly things that had happened had moved past. Time for new ugly things.
Well, there is that.
I don't want to get into the millennial story. I'm just kidding. Oh, man, that was nasty.
Well, actually, here's something I've noticed, though, Jack, and this is an interesting point. Now, this may take us somewhere interesting. And you just did it. You've done this multiple times during our conversation. Don and I will say, well, look at this story, like an episode of Friends or something like that. And you'll say, no, look at the Friends as a whole overall story. Don't look at it as the individual episode. And you just did that again with Mad Max. You said, well, no, Mad Max doesn't... No, look at the whole... You have to look at the whole thing. But the thing is, those weren't planned. You're looking at things that kind of, or the Cosby Show, it developed organically as it went on. The characters left because the actors literally got older and wanted more money or whatever. Those are organic events that were occurring. Those were not planned out of any story sense. In most cases, they weren't. They were kind of accidents that happened.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Do you think Mad Max would still be as resonant today if we only had that one movie back then?
Yeah, because we're basically living it now, so people would be
like,
too,
No, I think it would. Well, it'd be no different than Damnation Alley. It'd be no different than many of those other movies that, Death Race 2000, all those kinds of movies that had their own post-apocalyptic stuff. But I think what made it resonate for people was you had the full hero's journey. You had to go to Beyond Thunderdome to be able to sit there and people go, yeah, that was a great series, right? So, it was, you can say, wow, that was a fun movie. But what makes Star Wars even, Star Wars, it could have ended at 4 and that was fine. It couldn't end it at 5. Mm-hmm. Right?
Well, because it had a cliffhanger. Basically.
I know, but there's all sorts of movies that ended off in a cliffhanger too, and they never came back.
Well, that's true. Actually, and oddly enough, people consider 5 like probably the best of all of them. There's a great many people who consider that's the best movie of all of them, even though it actually doesn't have a proper ending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and absolutely. But again,
doesn't that go against what you're just saying?
Not necessarily, because we could go and take apart 5 and find the same thing going on in the hero's journey there too, right? The hero's journey doesn't say everything has to be resolved to the end, but you notice that at the end of 5, they all get back together and they have purpose. So there's a transformational moment there of bringing Lando Calrissian into the team. They all have purpose. They know what they're going to do. They will get Han back. There's no question about that, right? At the end of 5. That's the aspect. So that's why people leave it at that. If they just left it at that Han being taken and they don't have that moment back, that return of them getting back together in the Millennium Falcon. See, there's the return again, right? The return, getting back in the Millennium Falcon, people would have went, oh, come on, that's a jip. What's going to happen next, right? But they do. They're smart enough. Lawrence Kasdan is smart enough to do that. And you know, right? I take the whole story as whole cloth because that's what we're looking at is the whole story. If you want to look at independent pieces and see what part of the hero's journey they do and where they work well and where they don't work well, that's awesome. But even the Cosby story, I mean, if that only went one season, it would have gone the same. It would have been like, wow, that could have been a really good show. Or that had some really good episodes. That would have been like the Brady Bunch, right? It's the growth that we go through those characters. It's how we share with those characters that makes us want to look at that show in a much more fonder way.
See, now this is where I think we're getting at what I was talking about at the beginning that I wanted to get at later. Because again, I think you have to, what Rob calls organic, I would call inorganic. Because it's the idea that stuff happens not as part of the story. Like you go to Mad Max, I don't think there was supposed to be a second movie, and you can tell because
there wasn't. He never planned on there being a second movie.
Yeah, because
it's supposed to end with the Road Warrior.
Yeah, because when the second movie starts off, they completely changed the backstory in that little speech at the beginning.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And it's because
Road Warrior you're talking about, right? The Road
Warrior, yes.
And it was because it was only supposed to be that one film. When you look at, like I say, with just about any sitcom ever, the only reason you have development, you have characters, Bobby's going to school now, is, again, because of stuff that doesn't relate to the story. It's because the actors are getting old. Like Rob said, they want more money. The cute kid isn't cute anymore. It's actually an attempt to kind of go back to a sort of homeostasis. Now we look at it as development because our brains, when we get stuff, are normally going to put them together. We look for patterns. We think of a story, like for watching a TV show, we think of it as a seamless whole, even though it's not. It's just a potash of parts that are thrown into a blender and see what happens. Because that's sort of the argument that I would make. Go back to, say, the pulp era and their modern descendants, the superhero. A character like, say, Spider-Man or Batman exists in a bunch of different incarnations. You think, say, like Spider-Man, there's the comic. There's the old comics that are different from the current ones. There's Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. There's like the 90s cartoon. There's been like, 3 or 4 different movie versions. And we put that into a gestalt when we watch them. Our concept of Spider-Man is influenced by whatever of those we let in. And a lot of what we let in is kind of based on age and novelty. Because when you first encounter something like that, you don't have a full concept. It's not for a little bit till you start solidifying that idea, and then that's where the nerd rage comes in when they reboot it again and you don't like this guy and it's different from that. But I think, like I say, I think for a while you run into that, and that's one of the reasons why I think people, especially when they're writing, kind of there's different. Like I say, I don't think the hero's journey is the core of every story ever made, because I think there's other circumstances that kind of usurp it.
I didn't argue that. What I argue is it's the core of every good story that's ever made.
See,
stories fall off their perch when they stop following the hero's journey, and that's when people fall apart. Even let's use your comic example. Mm-hmm. What are our favorite comics of Batman and Superman? They're the ones that follow a hero's journey. Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, total hero's journey. Batman Year One, total hero's journey. Batman, you can go through any one of those particular tightly knit ones,
right.
Hero's journey. I mean, I remember reading a 2-parter Alan Moore comic of Superman that he wrote back in the late 70s, and it was the death of Superman, and it follows exactly the hero's journey. And they said, oh, this is an Elsewhere comic kind of thing. It wasn't really an Elsewhere. It was like, this could have happened, or it may not happen kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is that those things that are transformative, Red Sun, all those kinds of things that we look at, that we go, yeah, that's what I love about Superman. because I love this particular story, or I love this the other comics that we read and enjoy and we forget tomorrow. It's because they don't resonate with the hero's journey.
See, I think that's wrong. And I would say because when you think of it, say Batman Year One, Total Hero's Journey, added like 70 years after the series started, and it was added after that time when the hero's journey became the big thing.
Okay, so tell me what your favorite Batman comic is then.
Not really a big Batman fan.
But that's what my point is that if you're going to articulate your favorite Batman stories, and even kids back in the day, I know I had old Batman stories myself. I had old comics my dad had. And the ones that were my favorites were the ones I could probably look back and say, yeah, this followed a hero's journey of some sort. Like one of my favorites in the 80s was a Hugo Strange one where Hugo Strange robs Bruce Wayne of everything.
Right.
Takes his entire personality, takes his character, takes Wayne Manor, and he's he goes nuts and wears the Batman costume, and you can tell it's not him, even though he's got this buff body like Batman, just because he has the Hugo Strange beard and glasses, right? You know, but again, I remember that story, looking back now, because it followed those elements of the hero's journey. I love Batman regardless. But those individual stories that I enjoyed because they resonated those things. So yeah, you're right. There's all sorts of stories that don't follow it. We call those failed stories overall. Like they don't last long. The character lasts,
right?
But the story themselves don't, right?
But that's what I mean. Can you call 70 years worth of stories failed?
No, but I can tell you that within those 70 years, there are stories that were the hero's journey, like his origin story. Usually the origin stories are direct hero's journeys, right? And that's what resonates with people. And they go back looking for that next kick of that origin story. Some people will never find it because the best story of a superhero generally tends to be their origin story and their ending story.
Right.
But because of that static nature that we want to have. But you still go back looking for that kick because, oh my God, the origin story of Batman is so cool.
Right. That's an interesting point.
How am I doing?
You're doing pretty well, actually. You managed to defend the hero's journey pretty well.
Well, there's a reason why for 30 years I've loved this thing. I've tried. I do a lot of thinking about stories, and so when you guys did, and nothing against you guys, do great analysis, and I didn't know a lot about the procedures, but when I started to look at how the procedurals roll out, I think, yeah, they're just slow heroes' journeys. They're just slow heroes' journeys. And one of the reasons I don't like, we had a really good point, one of the reasons I don't like Law and Order is because they operate so slowly. And I had this conversation with my parents, and I don't like procedurals for the most part. I mean, police procedurals for that reason.
Right.
I like mysteries because they tend to follow that kind of hero's journey a little better. And I didn't realize that until I just said that now. But I talked to my parents who love Law and Order, and I said, the characters don't freaking change. And they said to me, because they've seen them all, yes, they do. And that's part of the fun for us, is realizing that it's not about the character, it's about the story. But every once in a while, they'll reveal something which adds to that character from then on for the rest of the series. So that's what I'm thinking, oh, okay, so this obviously is a hero's journey. It just ends up being such a slow pace because they want to either keep it going through the procedural style of things or whatever it is, that's why it doesn't seem like it is. It's still going to have a call to adventure that's going on. Usually the call to adventure procedure is there's a crime that's been committed, right? And there's a resolution.
Hold on a sec, Jack. Hold on 1 second there.
We're talking about the police procedurals, right?
Okay. Yeah, we're talking police procedurals. Okay. Yeah, but in Law and Order, okay, having watched many of them over the years and that.
Oh, good.
No, I was a fan for a while, and they played them to death back when I was in university, and years later, Don and I both watched them quite a bit.
Oh, cool.
In Law and Order, yes, they did have those little character bits that eventually worked in, but the truth is, a lot of them were basically filler, or just, little character detail, and they didn't have any calls to adventure or any of that. There might be a quote-unquote call to adventure in a single episode, if you want to call somebody randomly stumbling over a body a call to adventure, there it is. But that's within the story. but within the actual,
Yeah.
as in the whole series, like the characters themselves didn't really have arcs.
They did. Yes, they did. Some characters left. Some characters left, and some characters changed their jobs, and some characters did different things in the long term of stuff. Some characters died.
But they would come in, and then they would do their thing each week, and then and that would be it. But no, they didn't actually there was no call to adventure for the characters or anything like that. Mm-hmm. They had a few things happen in their life that might have been mildly interesting for the audience, and then eventually they just leave when their time is up in the show. They don't really have a true arc going on, and what is happening is mostly circumstance. It's mostly just whatever they think will add a little flavor to that particular episode. They have that characters kind of dealing with something tangentially connected to kind of add a little depth to it. But that's not planned, which goes back to my earlier comment about organic stuff, where so much of what we see in modern television in shows like Law and Order is not planned. And my point is, a hero's journey is a planned story.
Nah, I don't know. No, I don't think so. I don't think it has to be.
That's one of the reasons we're running into difficulty here.
I think you're back to that Hollywood ideal of it has to be a particular format to say that it has to be a planned story that way. I think our lives being a hero's journey, it's not planned. I mean, we do the very best that we can, but if you look upon the tracks of your life, you're going to start to see, at least I certainly can see, maybe it's just my own hallucination.
Humans
but I can
are pattern-making machines, of course.
Exactly. and but isn't that what the hero's journey is? It's a pattern that we identify, right? That we identify, oh, yep, this is where I had this happen. This is where I had this happen. And it all fits within the hero's journey. Maybe for Law & Order, the call to adventure was, here's my job. I'm just setting up my desk. And this is my call to adventure, just like it is for my students going into their grade 9 thing. It's not always, oh my God, I have to pull the sword from the stone. Like that's...
But that's where we get to what Don was talking about, where there's a character's hero's journey, and then there's actually procedural stories, as we talked about before, where the hero's journey is not the focus at all. It's actually about the plot. It's about the events that happen. And there may or may not be any kind of hero's journey going on. It doesn't matter. And it's not. There might be one, but it's incidental more than anything else.
But again, you're assuming that the hero's journey is a character story. Where once we said, like again, back to Joseph Campbell, he says it could be all about transforming society, which is not the personal hero's journey. And that's certainly what Law and Order is about: is trying to transform society one case at a time, right?
That's a valid point. And within the individual episode, I mean, I suppose that's true. Restore the balance of justice, which is what most mysteries are doing. That's true.
And I think this is the problem, is that we keep coming back to what you guys keep seeing as the hero's journey is that Hollywood template, right? It has to be a transformative thing for this main character. It has to be this kind of thing. It's like, but Joseph Campbell say no. The hero's journey could be a merry band of fellows all going through the same plots to try to be able to modify things, like the Red Branch, for example. It's the Celtic version of King Arthur, Cuchulainn and the Red Branch, right? Those stories are, yes, Cuchulainn is one of the main heroes, but the Red Branch also is like the main focus of it, just like King Arthur and his the Knights of the Round Table. It's not just all stories about Arthur. It's not just, those are certainly the whole Arthurian Vulgate or the Arthuriad, as they call it. That certainly is a hero's journey. Part of it is Arthur's journey, but the main aspect is transforming the world for a more kinder place through the various different characters and the plots that they get involved in. So it's not just a single person's journey, which is what Hollywood wants to make it, because they want to make it relatable, right? Mm-hmm. It's like we want these 4-year-old kids to be able to buy action figures and stuff like that. But that's just a dumbed down version of what Joseph Campbell was saying. Look, this is what I find in every single story, well done story that lasts in cultures all around the world.
Right, and that's there are two issues that I see. Okay, and this now I actually, generally speaking, I'll be honest with you, Jeff. Generally speaking, I agree with you. Okay, actually, I generally do overall, but I do see two issues with the hero's journey as you present it. Okay, and having not read Campbell, which is my own fault, I should at some point, I admit. So issue number one is that the hero's journey, as you're presenting it, is so frickin' vague that it can accomplish anything. It's only. I made a joke to you in our email exchange about, wow, if you could just get rid of 2 more steps, you can call it a 3-step story or maybe a 3-act story instead. All stories have a beginning, middle, and end. Well, thank you, Shakespeare. I didn't know that. And that's like the hero's journey is such an incredibly. It's so generic that unless you do add like that focus of transforming society or that, it really doesn't really mean, okay, so a character goes out and does something. Well, okay, congratulations. That's effectively all you're saying. A character go out and does something. Okay, yeah, well, that's every story, pretty much. And is that really useful?
We can end right now, because I think you just agreed with me. Because that's my whole point is that it's every real story that happens. So to argue against it makes no sense. And yeah, it's useful in the respect that once you understand that it's every real story, then you can start looking at, okay, so how does the hero's journey take place in this way? Well, it takes place in a procedural, or it takes place in a gothic romance, or it takes place in this kind of format, or it takes place in this kind of format. But understanding, like you say, it's universal. It's not a bug, it's a feature, man. That's the whole aspect.
Hold on, Jack. What you're big then that I have another name for it. I just had a brilliant idea. There's another thing we should call the hero's journey. We should just call it a story. How about that? How about we just call it a story and stop calling it a hero's journey instead?
Sounds great.
Weird.
He understood he identified the underlying aspect of story. We're agreed.
Okay, but at that point, it's so vague, it's not useful.
But
anymore.
no, it's not. It's not vague. He has the very specific steps that you have to go through. I just outlined every time you bring up an example. I outline how that example works, or it doesn't work, right? Because if it doesn't work, then they don't end up being long-term stories.
Or
if you take a look at those.
Or you could argue that the elements that you're presenting are so incredibly vague they can be made to fit any story, as opposed to any story fits them. Which is what I was kind of getting at earlier when I was talking about the movie examples you used. Did they choose it or did it choose them?
Well, no, I think that's a little unfair. If he identifies the call to adventure, that's an identifying a signpost. The fact that every story has it is not his fault that he identified it.
That's true. The fact that every story has it.
So that every story
has to have a beginning.
That every story, it has to have a beginning. But the idea that he recognizes is not just a beginning; it's a call to adventure. That adventure either comes to the character searches adventure. That's a little more than just saying it has a beginning, right?
That's
not to
true.
Not to mention that the other aspect of crossing the threshold. That's not just saying it's a middle. That's an actual point of what's going on in the story, right? Not to mention saying things like, in the belly of the beast being the darkest part, the worst possible circumstances. Now, we recognize that as writers, that you have to, reach further and further up to get to that critical mass. But he names it. He names exactly how it looks and what's supposed to happen. Just like he names, it doesn't have to say, the end doesn't mean you have to go back to the beginning, or you have to go back in one way or another to a return for those reasons. And Campbell identifies why that needs to happen to make the story work really well. So it's not a beginning, middle, and end. That's a really oversimplification, right? He does identify very specific elements that just so happen to work for all these things. It's not his fault that he describes it. You can't just say it's nebulously. You can't just nebulously say, well, it's just the same as the beginning. Well, it's a little more than a beginning when you say adventure follows the hero, or the hero captures adventure, right? You can say the beginning is, well, I just opened the door and here's my chair. Right. That's the beginning of a scene, but it's not the beginning of a story. Story happens when you have some sort of inciting element which draws the person into an adventure. Now, we recognize the word as inciting element. That's more of a modern take. Why? Because we started to understand the aspects of how this happens, that there is some sort of call to adventure that goes on.
See, this is...
Okay, Don.
Oh, I was going to say, I think you're kind of getting at... Because this is where, I kind of... What I think makes, say, Law & Order not a hero's journey is the end. Because, like I say, I think there's a difference between a transformation and a resolution. So they catch the crook goes in jail. That's a resolution. It's not exactly a transformation because next week there's going to be another crook, and chances are
the world's a better place from that crook being gone. They're going to stop that person from killing again. You know, there's also even the laws of universal justice are upheld in one way or another. A person, he may never kill again. Maybe it's killing his wife, but the fact that the justice is balanced. The scales are balanced in one way or another, right?
Well, yeah,
in that respect.
But that again, what you've basically just sort of done is and this is where I think a procedural is different from the hero's journey is you've basically just gone back to the beginning, and then next episode, I wouldn't consider it. It's not a call to adventure when the next crime happens because it's the purpose of these characters. They're detectives to solve crimes, so it's kind of again a process, not a journey.
Well, here's where I disagree again. I'm sorry I'm giving you guys such a hard time, but
we're giving you a hard time too, so it's fair.
let's say that the character says, no, I'm not going to do this case.
Mm-hmm.
They're no longer the hero of that story. They are now a victim waiting to be saved. They either have to somehow change their mind, or we have to find out a way to help them to become better, or they leave the show. So there is a call to adventure in that respect where we are all answered to a challenge that happens to us. And in the story, that's the challenge that happens to them. It's not like, I mean, yeah, in a real case when we're looking at it as police officers, This is just another case. But people choose to be police for a reason. They don't just do it for a paycheck, right?
See, but that's the thing, because I think you can deny the call, as it were, to use the current phraseology, and you're still the protagonist. Like, I mean, that was the whole point of, like, the first Mad Max. That they were trying to force adventure on him, and he just kept turning it down, and he became the victim. That's literally what the first Mad Max is all about, him becoming the victim. But that was the story. Like, it wasn't... It was...
Was it really, though? Because if it was, he would have walked away and he would have been killed. He answered the call. He just didn't answer it the way they liked it.
No, well...
the whole idea of being Mad Max is he did things his own way. That was his call. That was his answer.
Well, no, actually, it was the opposite, was that he didn't do it. He didn't want to be the hero, and he loses his family, he loses his job, the end of the movie, all he's got is his shotgun and a car.
But that's what I mean. He still answered that call in the respect that he didn't seek adventure. Adventure sought him, and he had to make those choices. He could have walked away, but he went for revenge, right? He went for revenge for everything that happened. Mm-hmm. That's answering the call. That's not ignoring it. That's not stepping away from it.
See, that's where, again, I think... Because I think what ends up happening, and this is where... I don't like the idea of getting wrapped around the axle with the hero's journey, is because I think, to stick within the hero's journey model, you can have a perfectly valid story that stops at any of those steps.
Yeah, but I don't think it's going to resonate. That's my concern. See, here's where I think you guys are stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think you're stuck on the idea that if you take the hero's journey as a universal,
mm-hmm.
you feel hemmed in by it. And that you feel that there should be more that we can do as writers than just have to do the hero's journey. And or as Rob would take the opposite side of this and say, or it's so meaningless it doesn't matter anyway. Whereas I would say, look, okay, let's look at what I'm trying to suggest is that human beings have certain things that we do all the time. Mm-hmm. We breathe, we eat, we crap, we drink water, we connect in social ways, we connect with stories in social ways, we connect stories in a particular manner in social ways, probably different than cockroaches do. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to follow the Hollywood version of what the hero's journey is. What it means is if you take a look at how Joseph Campbell identifies the massive variety of how the hero's journey shows up in varieties of cultures, it leaves a huge array. So like I said before in the blog post, the hero's journey is the road. Mm-hmm. How you decide what that road is depends upon whether you're using a procedural or whether you're using something else. It could be a city road. It could be a country road. It could be, but that point A to point B, all those places in between, that's just a way of measuring how you're doing on that journey. It's not defining where specifically that journey goes in, what ending specifically it has to take. It's just telling you to have a sense of that denouement, of that full feeling that people have when they have a story. And we all know what it's like. We've gone to a movie and we go, well, that was a great movie, but the ending sucked, and therefore the movie sucked. To have all those things happen in a story, well, there's a reason why the hero's journey has lasted so long. Is because it is the monomyth.
I think there's a difference in purpose that we're looking at, because any example that I come up with that doesn't fit the pattern, you use the retort, well, and it's not generally remembered. It doesn't make a lasting impact. And I think you're right, but I don't think every story should have to. People will say, go watch a slasher flick, and for 2 hours that slasher flick is their universe, and then it's over and they go home and probably never think of it again until 20 years down the line when somebody remakes it, and they're like, oh, I remember that.
Sure.
And I think that kind of thing is perfectly fine, and I don't think, even though it doesn't have a long shelf life, I don't think that necessarily makes it an invalid story.
Of course not. You're absolutely right. But I thought the original purpose of what you guys were talking about was how to make good stories.
It is, but I think, and this is where the definition of good, I think, differs. Because I do think you can make a story that it burns incredibly brightly in the hearts of your audience for an hour, and then it's done. But you get that hour. There's things all the time that you grow up with that you're like, this is just, it's the greatest thing ever. And then 10 years down the line, you'd feel embarrassed that you ever cared. But for that time, for that moment, you make that connection that it's magical. It's this big thing. And then it's done, but moments don't last forever. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong to not want to hang on to that.
Oh, you mean like Quark?
Well,
I look back upon Quark and I'm embarrassed that I watched that show, but I loved it growing up. No, and again, there's no argument about that, Don. My job as a writer is to try to write the thing that will last, the thing that people will appreciate and enjoy, and something that will be able to touch different generations. There are lots of people who write, and they're often called bloggers, write something that people will go, wow, that's amazing. That's the latest BuzzFeed thing. And you chew it, it's like bubble gum, you spit it out 5 minutes later, and you forgot you even read it. And then 2 years down the line, somebody sends you the link, and you go, wow, it's amazing. Oh, crap, I read that already. Yeah, it's pretty boring. That's great. You're right. There's lots of room for Drek in the world. But I mean, when I say Drek, I don't mean Drek as in something that is terrible. I mean, Drek as in pulpy fun that has no lasting meaning. That there's lots of room for that, and there always will be, right? But as somebody, and I'm sure maybe Rob, I'm speaking for you, but as a writer, I want to have something that lasts.
Be nice.
And it doesn't have to be Shakespeare. But if somebody else can pick something up 2 generations from now and it still resonates with them, my job's done. Right? So that's what I'm always looking for. And if that's what you're looking to do as a writer, you can't veer away from the hero's journey. Because we know those things that last have in some way followed the hero's journey.
See, there's something there that I don't feel is quite the entire picture. There's some underlying element to that, because I don't think, if you talk things that last, I don't think it's entirely a product of the thing in and of itself. I think there's a lot of circumstance you have to kind of take into account.
Well, there are also... I think I agree with Don on this one, where I think there is something missing. And I think that there's another element, but I can't quite put my finger on it either. Don and I have actually discussed this before. There is something, like I said, Jack, generally I agree with you on the hero's journey, although, and this is going to sound really odd, but I think that and I refer to you, this is a generational thing, so I'm going to take you and I'm going to drag you along with us too, Jack, tend to actually be a little bit over-focused on change and transformation. And it's not just because of Vogler or Lucas or whatever, actually, although they were definite factors. I remember noticing this myself back in like the 90s and such when I was in university and such. And even before then I was kind of aware of this, where we grew up on episodic television, where nothing really did change, where every episode would begin and end at the exact same place that it always did. And episodic television is based, or procedural television, whatever you want to call it, is based on nothing happening. Because if something ever really did happen, it would change the show. And that's not what the audience wants, that's not what the producers want, and that's not the American system to milk it to death. So we lived in a time when we were constantly fed episodic stories that had no real change, and so we kind of grew up just desiring it or lusting for it, I suppose you could say, and being happy for whatever change we got, because that's not the way our stories tended to be told, at least not the ones we were consuming, like say Star Trek or whatever. And so as an end result, I found that I and many people that I knew tended to become a little bit focused on stories about change where stuff actually happened, just because we'd been deprived of it for so long as we were growing up.
Okay. No, finish your thought.
And so I think that we are inherently drawn. I think there is a natural desire for stories that involve change, because we like to see something happen. We want to see how things resolve. We're temporal beings. Things have a beginning, middle, and end, and we want to see how they end. And we don't feel complete unless we do see how they end. But at the same time, I think we're also, generationally, drawn to those kinds of stories because they represent something that we didn't get in our stories when we were young. That's basically all I'm saying.
Okay. I'll challenge your and you said this before, your assertion that Star Trek doesn't change. I challenge that entirely. The original Star Trek changed a lot. In fact, if you look carefully, you'll see the changes that were small in the series, and maybe they weren't intended to. But by the time you got to the movies, which is, again, the larger scope of the thing, the whole point of Spock's death being probably one of the most poignant deaths of science fiction history is because of the relationship and the trials and the things that happened between Kirk and Spock in the original series, right? So they absolutely grew and changed and grew together. And like the story of Star Trek, again, what's the main story of Star Trek? Brotherhood. That's the story of Star Trek, and not necessarily brotherhood is only guys. I mean a fellowship of that kind, and that happens, and you see that resonate specifically through probably 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6. Honestly, all the way through, you can see those things in the movies. But when they look at each other, and Kirk says, the word is no. We are therefore going anyway, and they say, and then he says things like, I can't ask you to go, and Sulu looks at him and says, Captain, I'd appreciate it if you just gave me the word, right? So these are elements of and that's what drew us without even knowing. That was the central theme. That's why I love Star Trek beyond all the action-packed stuff of like, geez, I hope I grow up and have a Spock friend and bones. You know what I mean? Because those people have your back constantly, right? And that's different from other things. And it was and that's what drew people into the idea of, my God, that vision of Star Trek was beyond that show of being a infinite diversity, an infinite number of combinations of that brotherhoods thing. Like, inspired people into NASA. It changed the Enterprise name for the shuttle to Enterprise. I mean, you know what I mean? All those things came from that hero's journey that we were all having. We were all transformed from Star Trek. So anyway, that's a little aside. I do see that. Of course, I'm a debater, so I'm arguing really hard for this side, but I think it has value, and I wouldn't argue it if it didn't have value. But I think you tapped on something, Rom, that I didn't even know about until you talked about it. I think when you have a society that is anxious for transformation, we want to see iterative change in our stories. So when you go back to the early times, you saw that when Homer was giving, daily reports of the Iliad, right? Mm-hmm. It was a continuous story that he was going on. Then you get into the talkies and all those kind of things up to the future, where these short little advents go on, and they're just trying to roll stuff out. But again, even my dad, what did he like to watch most? The serials, right? Because they were continuous of the story, and they had a beginning, a middle, and an end, but they also had that transformation of, and usually they were all sort of self-contained serials, right?
Yeah.
So they had their own little hero's journey that called that all the way thing. So then we get up to here. What bugs people most about like Next Generation for me and stuff like that it doesn't continue. It doesn't grow. Why did I love Babylon 5 better? Why did Babylon 5 win more awards than Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine?
Payola.
And it did. No, they had no money. They had no money. They had no money. They had the cheap Amiga special effects to deal with stuff. They had no money for any of that. And that's because people glommed on the fact like, oh my God, these people are going through a journey and I'm going through it with them. Mm-hmm. Whereas you have, and again, I keep bringing this up, but it drives me crazy. I can't wait for the Star Trek episode. I have to tell you now, the thing I hated most about Star Trek Next Generation, the one episode that stuck in my craw the most, was the one where Geordi gets brainwashed by the Romulans. Mm-hmm. And that was a good story. I liked that story. That's not what made me angry. What made me angry was at the end of the episode, he goes up to Deanna Troi, and they have this little conversation, and it's never mentioned again. Never mentioned again. Not even as a side. Not even as a movie. It was like, yeah, remember that time you were brainwashed and the next day you were fine? Right? And then you take a look at Babylon 5 and you've got the Doctor, and they tell his story of being addicted to stims. They tell that in 3 seasons. They build up the fact that, so you can see him using stims more and more and more. You can see him denying all that aspect. You can see him fighting with the addiction, and then you can see him breaking the addiction and then leaving Babylon 5 for a while to go on walkabout to be able to identify who he is. That's a story arc, that's a character arc, that's a hero arc that he goes through just within the larger arc of the whole thing. So, yeah, you're right. People are hungry for that, and I think it becomes a transformational aspect. Yeah. Because if it was just our generation, then the people in the 90s would be bored of it by now.
Why?
But they're not.
Why?
They're doing it more and more and more.
Yeah, I think Rob is right, though. I think Rob picked a bad example, though.
Okay.
Because you mentioned Babylon 5, and the plan from the beginning was for it to continue. But if you want to see that conflict between the old school serial way of doing like TV and the new school continuing way.
Just a second, Don. You're saying that Babylon 5 was meant to be more than 5 seasons? Because I understood it was only meant to be 5 seasons.
But that
was how he pitched it.
But that's what but that's what I mean. They said we're doing 5.
Okay.
Whereas when they did the Next Generation, it was we'll keep doing it till you stop watching. Like it was written
which
like
is most TV.
Yeah.
Of that period. Even a lot today.
Yeah, but where you can see the change really happen, it's from the same era. It was the X-Files. Because when it started, they were trying really hard to be the old school, like, episodic thing. Because you'd have, like, you had Scully. She's like, there are no aliens. You were just kidnapped by them. There's no monsters. You just had a dude crawl out of a drain pipe, try to eat your liver. There's, like, no such thing as, like, ghosts. You were almost, like, eaten by one. There's, like, no such thing as the paranormal. A possessed prisoner tried choking you out in jail. There's no such thing as the paranormal. A giant fucking grasshopper was trying to eat you. And that went on for a very long time. Like, much longer than you think it. Like, this woman has some...
That's why I stopped watching it after 3 seasons.
Yeah.
Right?
Because and
a lot of people did.
The people I knew didn't, and I had to see them all. And like I said before, I used to fuck it up for them. I would tell them how each season was going to end, because it wasn't till around 3 or 4 they said, continuing story, let's do that. Because everybody forgets in the first season there was like vampires that just disappeared.
Yeah, you're right.
Because it was supposed to just be Kolchak again, and
yeah.
But that's
a week.
Yeah,
and Kolchak didn't last either, did it?
Well, it was a season, but it was one of them things that if you want to talk something that made a big impression on people, that was a show. Like,
sure.
Anybody who saw it, like that to the point that when Chris Carter did the X-Files, he said, "Yeah, it's like Kolchak was awesome."
Yeah, but again, you're and I don't want to sound like I'm coming up with every excuse in the book, but we're talking about story, right? So if you think about Kolchak, tell me which story it was, which was the one that got people all awesome. People remember the monsters, right?
Uh-huh.
They remember the cool sort of things that happen in Kolchak, but you can't sit there and say it's his origin story or it's, you know what I mean?
No, you don't, and it didn't matter because it still made that huge impression on people. I think from what I know of talking to people, it was him. It was because that character, he wasn't the guy that normally hunts monsters. He's a cowardly, obnoxious little jerk, and that wasn't the hero. But he was tenacious, and that's what kept him in it. And this is where I'm saying that, like, yeah, for the people who saw it, it made a huge impact, even though it doesn't follow any kind of progression, even though it's directly episodic. And again, I think that's fine. I think episodic is perfectly acceptable. You can do a valid, meaningful, deep story if you want in that way. You don't have to have it this, like Rob was saying, the idea of change and growth and development is sort of a new fetish for entertainment.
Well, that you just said yourself. It's not a valid, deep story, Kolchak. Well, it's a quirky character that we liked, right?
Well, it depends.
I mean, and even if you look at the X-Files, this series was important, and that again, the series eventually was transformative in the respect, right? People changed and all that. We actually lost characters in that show, and you can say it's organic or inorganic or whatever you want, but I'm just saying they went through a transformation. The reason why effectively that it almost failed in that is that the movies, the TV movies that they came out with were flops, or the even the theater movies came out were flops. It only ended up when they did that retrospective 6-episode series to go back to it, and then it was because we wanted to see the change that had happened to them in the previous time. People were curious about that aspect.
Yeah.
You didn't get a bunch of new watchers to watch X-Files. You watched the old people to see, are they still together? Because remember, that's the whole aspect of X-Files, was the real story about X-Files was part of it. Part of it was, did Mulder's daughter or sister really get kidnapped, and can we ever find her again, right? But the deep story of X-Files is, are they ever going to get together?
Yeah, but my thing to that would be the thing with X-Files, why the movies and that flopped, I think, is just because it was a product of its time. And when that was no longer the zeitgeist, people just couldn't connect with it. And to that effect, if you want to talk about change and development, look at, say, prior to the 90s, how many TV shows were based on that, will they or won't they? And as soon as they did, nobody gave a shit. As soon as there was actual transformation, everybody got off the ship.
Yeah, you're exactly, because that was the end of the story as far as they knew, right? Because that was, if you make the story about that, then when that story is over, that's all they care about. And when X-Files, when it came down to will they or won't they, it lost its sparkle as well. It's very hard to do that. I mean, I'm trying to think of a show where they still kept it. There was one, you could go back to ones that are all that. But again, if that's what your question is, if that's what the quest is, will Scarecrow and Mrs. King get together? There's an old one for you.
Right.
Yeah, that's an old reference, yeah.
Will they get together in Moonlighting, right?
Right.
Those whole shows were based upon that. None of the other stuff mattered. That was the hero's journey for those characters.
It was.
And so, of course, when they were done, they were done.
But see, and that's where I say, the problem with that is, it's not... I wouldn't necessarily call it the hero's journey, because like you say, when it's done, but it's not because it wrapped up and everybody goes, oh, that's how it is. It's because everyone, oh my God, it's different now and I hate it.
Well, no, but don't you understand, Don? It's different because the hero's journey was over for the people who watched it. It wasn't done for the writers, but that's because they misunderstood the hero's journey. Mm-hmm. They misunderstood what the journey was about, right? So, and you can say, well, that's not really a hero's journey, but love is probably one of the greatest hero's journeys that we all go through, right? Mm-hmm. So that idea of aspect. So for many people, that's it. So it is the climax of what's happening, and then they want to know the denouement, and then that's what happens, and it's over, and okay, good, that story is over now, and I hate everything else it came up with because you were setting me up for that. Like, go back to Scarecrow and Mrs. King, which nobody remembers but me, right? But Scarecrow and Mrs. King, that was the whole thing, right? She was married at one point, and that was keeping them apart, but then they got rid of that obstacle. So then you got rid of those guardians in that way, and then you kept moving towards and falling apart, and moving towards and falling apart. You got all those obstacles. The moment they were together, done. Thank you. Hero's journey over. We're done. Why are you giving me more about the story? I don't care about anything else, because that's not what the story was about. Mm-hmm. That's not what the call to adventure was about.
See, and I think that's where we differ, because I think, like in those cases, I don't think the characters were actually characters. They were, in a way, ciphers. That they were again, a product, like, say, like the Brady Bunch era, that you knew every day that the two characters were going to bicker, and you knew that there was going to be, like, that sexual tension, and that's what, like, drew you in. But
sure, there
was no desire for that to be resolved, because they're not exactly characters. They're not people. They're banter machines. Like in the audio.
No, you don't get into banter machines until you start getting into like Seinfeld and stuff like that, right? I mean, I wanted to be Scarecrow. I wanted to be a secret agent. I wanted to have the hot, ex angel in love with me, right? So we watch these shows together because it's fantasy that we want to fulfill. It's the stories that we want to be able to have come true in our lives or avoid, if you're talking about horror movies and stuff like that. I mean, even Heart to Heart. I'm still hating you. Heart to Heart. Remember that show? Even old. Heart to Heart, they were. I know, I'm old. Thank you very much. Welcome to Fantasy Island. Heart to Heart was a story about a married couple, but they weren't any married couple. They had action and adventure, and they had passion for each other, and so people look at that stuff, and even though you're right, they're absolutely ciphers. They're not genuine characters in the same way where we expect the flaws in that. That's not what people are looking for, and that's not necessarily, it can or it doesn't have to be part of the hero's journey. How developed your character is not really part of the hero's journey. How developed the character finish off is not necessarily part of the hero's journey. Mm-hmm. That there is some kind of progress or regress and I don't even say regress, because I use this argument in Breaking Bad. Mm-hmm. He doesn't regress to the point in the end. In Breaking Bad, he follows that hero's journey to the point. He comes to it's that idea that becoming evil only works in a story if you accept who you are in the end, right? Because then people respect that. They respect that, you know what? He was an asshole, but he knew he was an asshole, right? So, and he was fine with that because he still did the things that he had to do. Right. And so that's people respect that, because once again, you look up on the screen, you look at that character, and you go, yeah, I would be Walter White, because I wouldn't be a sniveling little wimp when cancer comes to get me. I would, because remember, he gave away all this money. Remember, I don't know if you saw all of it. I saw it all. Mm-hmm. But he met his friend. Remember, his friend made a ton of money based upon the stuff that they did together?
Right.
And he was really, really resentful. And that was part of what drove him deeper into the crime thing, because now his pride was in place. Mm-hmm. It's like, I could have had all that stuff, right? So, and that was part of that journey too, because he didn't realize how important pride was to him until that moment. And that's middle of the way, right? Mm-hmm. So he's uncovering all those things. So again, to say that the Breaking Bad is just a procedural, oh my God, the transformation that goes with that character and with the world around him in understanding who he is. And when I say the world around him, I mean the people around him, because that's what we're really talking about in the smaller hero's journey, not the epic. The epic does transform the entire world. That's where you save you destroy the Death Star, you throw the ring in Mount Doom, or whatever it is. But in the other ones, the ones that are really truly character based, because I would argue those epic ones are always plot based. The truly character based ones are based around the transformation that happens to the character themselves, or the people around them in the story.
See, I would I can't disagree with you on the Breaking Bad, but I think that's again this post '90s idea. I would go back. I kind of take Scott McCloud's take on things. And I would say you get something like, say, Moonlighting or Cheers or what was the Tony Danza one there?
Who's the Boss?
Who's the Boss?
Yeah. And the will they or won't they thing, I think in a lot of ways is, as Scott McCloud would say it, it's kind of a mask that it's like you said, I wish I could be a secret agent and have this like ex-angel that I hang out with and that. And people read themselves into that, and they connect. And what ends up happening is when you resolve it, it's not because that story is over, but what you've done is you've separated the character from the audience. You've broken that connection because now they're not following the script that I was totally in love with. And that's part of it breaks that kind of reading yourself in. It breaks.
Well, I think it breaks. Again, my argument would be it breaks the hero's journey for that watcher, because unconsciously you know what works and what doesn't. Unconsciously, you get the idea of what the story is about. If you don't get what the story is about, the story is very convoluted. Would you agree with that, Rob?
Yeah. I'd agree with that.
Generally, it could be complex, and requires some thinking. But if you can't piece out at the end of the movie and figure out, oh my God, what was this movie ever about anyway? Then it's fallen off of the hero's journey. It's fallen off of any kind of format and the whole bit. But in the end, when people disconnect with that will he or won't he, that's a very simplistic version of the hero's journey. That's the impetus. I bet you that's the selling point of what all those shows was like, yeah, it's going to be a comedy, it's going to be about families, but you know what? They're both single. And they have an attraction. But she can't go out with him because he's the maid. How about that for a switch, right? Tony Danza is the maid for her house, and she's a strong woman, and she's got too much gumption. That's right, she's too strong to want to give in to her desires for Tony Danza. We're gonna draw this sucker up forever. You know, it's gonna be really, really good. And then when they get married, the show canceled in like a year and a half or something, whatever it was. Right?
Actually, you're wrong
because people were done.
You're completely wrong about that one last point, though. This is one of those.
Yeah, it kind of. Did it go on?
No, this is the exact opposite. The producers were worried it wouldn't work in syndication if they got together. So in the end, they just kind of look at each other and go, "Yeah, it's not working for me."
Oh, that's right.
And they actually just go. He just moves out and they just break up. That's just how.
But that's perfect then, right? Because then you draw you draw everybody together for that whole hero's journey. You have a resolution that that they transform and realize that they can't be together. That's still a transformation, right? It may not be what people want per end, but it still follows that hero's journey as like of self-discovery.
They never were together.
Well, no,
their relationship was pretty much the same as season 1 as it was in season 7. It's the same relationship.
They did kiss. They did kiss.
In the end, they just go, okay, no, we're not, and they just
no,
apart.
They did kiss. I remember they did kiss, and they did have this conversation, and they did look at each other as to where it was going to happen. I remember, because I watched too much TV. I remember watching that series too, and I remember that he had a conversation. They kissed, and they had a conversation. I remember Tony Danza had a conversation with Alyssa Milano, and she was urging him to go out with her. Right? So there was the climax of the tension of this. It wasn't sort of a throw off the shoulder like, yeah, we never meant it. No, it was a build up, and like that's interesting. I didn't realize at the end that was the producers were afraid that he's like,
Because this was the time when
and
they were
I could
making
see
big
that.
bucks off syndication, right? So
And not just syndication out of order.
yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
They had to be
So,
able to do
yeah,
that.
exactly.
And that was a big part of American TV, remember? It goes back to what I was saying earlier.
Oh,
it was all designed
sure.
to be watched in any order possible because it was expected these episodes were going to just be randomly whipped out and used as filler, basically.
Yeah.
And so, see, here you guys are trying to hit me with all these ones that I can come up in argument, and I'm going to give you the one that I can't.
Okay.
You ready?
Okay.
And now, to be fair, it is a terrible show now, so I guess I could argue specifically that it really didn't. But it still it had incredible appeal at the time, and people still remember it now. Gilligan's Island.
That's true.
What changes in Gilligan's Island?
Nothing.
See, I think though that
point.
this, see, because you said something that I think kind of highlights my problem with your position. Like from my position, I guess you'd have to say, was because you said that people instinctively know what works, and I don't think that's quite right. Because I think what it is some things work. And they don't work because of some big underlying, like, structure. Sometimes it's just puerile. And that's what I was saying, where characters can be a cipher. Like, why did Gilligan's Island work? Nothing changes. There's no hero's journey. Yeah, but you had, like, 2 hot chicks and a weird guy getting hit in the head comedy. And that's all it took, and it makes that connection, it makes that resonance, even though it doesn't subscribe to the formula. It's a separate formula. It's a separate way. Because I would say a lot of comedy falls into that category.
Oh yeah, but I mean, again, just to go back to a point I keep saying is that which episode of Gilligan's Island is the best? None. You can't. You can come up with things that you remember. You can't come up with like a full story which is your best. Just like the whole Batman situation, right? It's like there are certain Batman stories that resonate for you. Now, maybe it's the pilot episode of Gilligan's Island because there's a transformation that goes on there in the pilot episode. Maybe it's when they come back. No, that was a terrible show. That was a terrible.
The Globetrotters!
I can't use that as an excuse. Yes, the Globetrotters. The Globetrotters, your favorite. But what happened in the Globetrotters show other than the Globetrotters were there? It was awesome.
The robot. They played basketball against a robot.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You remember images, right? But you don't. It's just like saying, what the best story of all is, Abbott and Costello. No, you remember who's on first. I mean, and you remember the odd sketch, and you might remember a movie that they did, which was really awesome. But that movie probably followed the hero's journey, so you'd remember the whole movie, or you remember bits. But remembering bits isn't a good story, right? And Gilligan's Island is about the bits. It's the hot bits with the girls, and it's about the bits where he's, a below skipper in his hammock and being hit in the head, right? So,
but see, now that's where we differ, because I think that's perfectly fine and it's perfectly valid as like a deep meaning story that resonated with me greatly. It's something, it still makes that emotional connection, and it can still make that intense emotional connection. And I don't think like that's inferior to not having something that this like deeper running thing. Like,
well, you just said it's deeper, and now you say it's not a deeper thing. So what I want a definition for you, Don, is what is a deep emotional connection or a deep connection to a story? What makes that for you? Because I have a connection to Gilligan's Island, which is a connection of being a child and enjoying the funny parts of it.
Right.
But that doesn't mean I have a deep connection to the story. And that's what we're arguing about, is story, right? How the story fits. And the story I'm not connected to. I'm connected to the setup. I'm connected to the funny bits. And I'm connected to the naughty bits.
Okay. See, now
So... And that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with chewing gum and spitting it out either. But again, we're talking about what makes resonating story, I thought.
Well, see, and this is where I think, again, you put that story bit at the end, and I don't think that's essential. I think a story that resonates is part of how you do that. But I don't think that's the only way to get that. Resonance is something, the way I would say is, it makes a deep impact on you. It's something that sort of like burns itself into your essence. It's just, it's always going to be there kind of thing. And moments can do that too. I mean, in real life, the stuff that does that are moments. There's specific events. There's specific one thing that happened. It's not that like you look back on your life and you analyze the flowchart of how all of these events related in that. It's you remember specific things. You remember that one home run when you were in like 5th grade, and that made you feel like a superstar. And there's been stories made on that premise that one event, because that one event registers with you, that has a big lasting effect that makes you who you are. And it's just one tiny thing. And that's why I say, like, there are plenty of stories that I love that made a very deep impact on me. And it might have been a character. It might have been a plot. It might have just been a visual. But I think that's just as, I'm going to have to pick another word, momentous as if it was this long, complex, character thing that gets right into the head of the character, or if it's this transformative event that happens in a that happens in a given story. Like, I don't think just because that doesn't happen, it's not as valuable a story.
Well, maybe, and here's something I'm going to throw at you. Maybe it's because you're creating the hero's journey in your head to make it valuable for you. And the reason why I'm saying that is let's examine what I would say is like one of the most baffling things for me and most nerddom is sports. So like one of the most important moments that resonates with so many people is Babe Ruth's pointing at the bleachers and hitting the ball, right? And that alone in isolation doesn't mean anything. Mm-hmm. You have to know who Babe Ruth is. You have to know his story. You have to know the shape of him. You have to know the power that he has. You have to know what he brings. You have to know all those kinds of things to make it really resonate.
Right.
And that's why I say, like, so when I'm talking to people who are sports people and they go, wow, I can't believe it's so-and-so, like Kobe Bryant is this. And I'm like, who cares? And they go, no, you don't understand. I've been following this team and since Kobe joined it. So Kobe's, for them, Kobe's already hit the call to adventure by joining their favorite team. Right. For them, he's already done this. So they've filled in the blanks of those moments to make it the hero's journey. Even if it hasn't been scripted that way, the story is fully in their head.
Yeah, but it is.
It's just like Wayne Gretzky. What's the biggest flaw of Wayne Gretzky as an immortal hero? Mm-hmm. He joined the LA Kings, right? Right. He became an American. He married an American. He became Darth Vader in people's minds because of that particular thing. But again, that doesn't mean anything unless you know who Wayne Gretzky is, unless you know his journey.
Yeah, but sports are sold like that.
Yeah, but I mean, everything's sold like that, which isn't the full story that you're talking about. Everything has that full resonance to you because you know the story behind it.
Yeah, but I'll put it to you this way. I love Quark. I thought Quark was awesome, and I thought it was awesome for 2 reasons. Number 1, I love the ship. It's got this weird ship with arms and a Pac-Man mouth. And number 2, the thing that made... And this really stuck with me, and Rob will probably laugh because he'll see how this formed my opinion of everything science fiction-y or fantasy I saw after. I thought the idea of a space garbage man was brilliant, because really, what do they do at the waste? You never see that. And then, and then that thought led me down the idea that you never see them do laundry. You never see, like, a space plumber. And all of this stuff would exist. And to me, this goes with setting. Like, the show was just a goofy comedy, but it struck this big chord because it painted for me this bigger picture of setting, and it highlighted a lot of what's missing from other science fiction kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And that shaped everything about me afterwards, and it has like nothing to do with the transformative anything. It has nothing to do with it, not even a progress. It's just the question, who flushes the toilet? And then it's...
Yeah, but I mean, there's the story for you. Is the story includes all these other science fiction stories, and the call to adventure is give me something different.
Yeah, but
you know what I mean. So,
but that's me. That's not Quark. That might.
Oh,
be
I know,
me.
and that
for me.
But that's that's what I'm trying to suggest is even the stories that aren't stories that still resonate with you. You're the one that makes the call to the hero myth. You're the one that makes the call to adventure. You're the one that makes all that stuff so that it works for you.
See, now,
by the way, I still love Quark until I watched it again. Did you watch it recently?
Yep, I got the disc.
Good for you, because I was like, oh my god, this is so bad. I feel so bad. My childhood Jamie is just killing himself because I loved it so much. I love Ficus the plant.
Yeah.
Right.
Beep, 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 beep.
Exactly. We don't have sex, we pollinate. Yep. I remember that, and I never saw that episode in like 30 years, right? So,
right.
But also part of the reason why I like Quark is because it made fun of Star Trek in some ways. Because it mimics Star Trek. Because it mimics Star Wars, right? See, so I'm already connecting it to the other heroes' journeys that I loved.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna have to go at Rob and Cull shenanigans on that one, though. Because, like I said, for me, what made the deep impact on me has nothing to do that. It's a structural element. Like, it's not what happens, it's the framework that something could happen in.
I can't certainly argue what connects with people if they articulate it themselves. And so I concede the point for you in that respect. I only suggest that to make something worthwhile, and probably when you didn't watch the DVDs for a long time, you probably remember elements like I do,
right.
but don't remember entire full stories put together.
See, I did.
Which was my main point to the very beginning is if we're talking about creating lasting story,
right,
and not images, not ideas, not a poster that we loved, not a song. Well, songs are stories in themselves, but not a tune of that stuff. Then if that's a whole different kind of thing. But if we're talking about something that is, I love this entire story, then that particular story in some way has to have followed, in my opinion, the hero's journey.
I think that's a good place.
I mean,
yep. Sorry.
Yeah. It's a good place to end. I mean, like I said, I loved Quark, but I remember the little things, like the guy before Ficus who was there for one season but lost his eye because he fell asleep looking through a microscope. I remember Gene and how bizarre that was. Very bizarre. But I remember if you told me what happened in episode 2 or
right.
Even what happened in the pilot episode, other than he was complaining that he got given that ship in the first place. And Conrad Janis was in it. I couldn't tell you what happened, in the story. The story itself was immaterial to the weirdness of it, right? So,
I can see that. Well, okay. On that note, thank you, Jack, for coming on. It's been an interesting and very spirited discussion.
Yes,
I'm not sure either side has actually budged all that much, but
right.
It's been a good think piece, and actually you've presented your case really well. I have to say that. And I'm sure that our listeners, those that managed to actually get through the whole thing, have been left with a lot to think about. Because I'm sure.
Well, I highly recommend you go read or watch The Power of Myth, which is Joseph Campbell's conversations with Bill Moyers.
Okay.
I highly recommend that you go buy The Hero with 1,000 Faces. The Masks of God, Primitive Mythology, gets into all the different aspects of how even primitive man had these basic stuff. And then, of course, his book, Transformations of Myths Through Time, is a really interesting read, too. That's just a couple of them that I have on my bookshelf that I think are awesome to go check out.
Okay. Sounds like they should definitely check them out, and I will link to them in the show notes.
Yeah. Of course, there's 2 other things I'd recommend, too.
Okay, what else, Don?
Everybody should read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Because that talks a lot about what an audience gets out of things and why. And everybody should immediately go to Amazon right this second and buy Quark on DVD, because that's the greatest TV show ever made.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. That's a great way to end it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, good night, folks. Have a good one.
Good night.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.